2 days ago in Auckland, New Zealand, Kellie-Jay Keen, a women's rights activist, was physically assaulted at her Let Women Speak event. She had called it Let Women Speak because she believes that women who have concerns about their sex-based rights are often silenced. And in an effort to disprove her arguments, large groups of angry men turned up to stop her from speaking. Here's an example of some of the protesters in action. I can't think why women would want men like this out of their spaces. Clearly, they must be evil bigots. It's the only explanation. Well, that was the conclusion of most of the Australian and New Zealand media. NewsHub, a major New Zealand TV channel, decided that it would smear the Let Women Speak event as anti-trans. This is something, by the way, that both The Guardian and the Daily Mail have also done this weekend, which is a reminder that the culture war has nothing to do with left or right. That said, NewsHub took it a step further, defaming Kellie-Jay Keen, also known as Posie Parker, as a white supremacist. In other words, rather than engage in actual journalism, they uncritically repeated the accusations of the most dishonest of Keen's critics. Great job, guys. Here's what they had to say.
Immigration New Zealand has decided to allow the controversial anti-trans campaigner known as Posie Parker into New Zealand. They reviewed her case on safety grounds after her rally in Melbourne attracted neo-Nazis.
Now, it is true that there were neo-Nazis at the Let Women Speak rally in Melbourne, but as the Australian Jewish Council noted, these were thugs who saw an opportunity to hijack the event for their own publicity. In fact, the neo-Nazis were clashing with Socialist Alliance, a supposedly anti-fascist group, who nonetheless seemed to be more concerned with shutting down a women's gathering than confronting, you know, the actual fascists. And yet, because these opportunistic neo-Nazi miscreants had gatecrashed the event, the Australian media conflated them with the women, claiming that they were allies. Because, of course, fascists are well known for their profound concern for women's safeguarding. Anyway, let's get back to NewsHub and their incredibly sophisticated journalism.
Has issued direct threats to the Prime Minister.
I tell you what, Chris.
Using a hand signal linked to white supremacists, which we've chosen to blur.
Revoke my visa. At your peril.
Wait, what? Kellie-Jay Keen has previously described white supremacy and racism as having no place in a civilised society. So if she was lying about that and wanted to keep her evil views secret, why would she start making overt white power gestures with her hand? None of this makes sense until you take away the blurring effect that NewsHub have put on the clip. NewsHub would like you to believe that this is the OK symbol, which has been co-opted by certain far-right groups. But when you watch the original footage, you can see she's just adjusting the zip on her top.
Let me just tell you this. Revoke my visa. At your peril.
But of course, by blurring it out, NewsHub can make it look a lot more sinister. As the commentator and podcaster Stephen Knight pointed out on his latest Substack, in that same video, Keen goes on to defend the speech rights of Maori women. As Knight puts it, that's an odd flex for someone intending to signal to their white supremacist supporters. Of course, defamation is a common tactic nowadays. People don't want to engage in discussion, so they make up lies instead. But if you're going to lie, at least make it vaguely plausible. NewsHub are openly misleading their viewers, presumably because they think their viewers are too stupid to know how to use a search engine. Well, job done. The lies have been spread, the temperature has been raised, and this is the result. So this footage is from the Let Women Speak event in Auckland, and there's also now footage circulating online of an elderly female attendee being punched at full force in the face by one of the protesters. Like all bullies, they pick on the weakest targets. The footage itself is actually too disturbing for us to show. No police were present, just a baying mob, mostly men, pushing, shoving and screaming abuse at one woman. If the stewards hadn't been so courageous, Keen could have been killed. And that, of course, is where all of this is leading. We are continually hearing that there is bad behaviour on both sides of this debate. I'm sorry, this is just not sustainable anymore. I've seen a few women's rights campaigners use abusive terms, throwing insults, and yes, behaving badly. But I've never seen women's rights campaigners sending death threats, rape threats, or attempting to punch anyone who takes an opposing view. Yet we see this all the time from trans activists. Not trans people, by the way, most of whom want to get on with their lives in peace and are extremely ill-served by these so-called allies who claim to represent them. J.K. Rowling, who has never said anything transphobic in her life, is nonetheless smeared as a hateful bigot and inundated on a daily basis with death threats. She has said she received so many that she could paper the house with them. And this is the point. It isn't just one or two bad apples. This kind of behaviour is the norm in this particular activist community. If you don't believe me, you can take a look at the website turfisaslur.com, where you can see hundreds of screenshots of violent threats and imagery against women campaigning for their rights. I won't show the worst ones here, they're far too disturbing, but here are some of the milder examples. Any trans allies at Pride London right now need to step the F up and take out the TERF trash. Get in their faces, make them afraid. Debate never works, so F them up. If you're a TERF, you can get F'd with the business end of the barbed wire baseball bat. Stab a TERF today. Remember to twist the knife and then remove it. These examples go on and on and on and on. And you know who doesn't post messages like this? Women. And yet many of the people issuing these threats want us to believe that they are women. It's hardly the most persuasive tactic. Here's what one activist wrote after watching the violence in Auckland. I got turned on today watching the fear in Posie Parker's eyes. She actually was fearing for her life. And you know who doesn't get sexually aroused by mob violence? Women. And most men, as it happens, but definitely not women. And yet so many mainstream commentators refuse to condemn these activists. They think this is simply a fragile, marginalised group standing up for themselves. A group so marginalised that they have the support of all major corporations and public institutions, are able to call on the police to arrest those who refuse to use the language that they demand, and are able to bully and physically assault women who are gathering peacefully to express their views. And the media and political class cheer them on. And this is entirely backward, and it has to stop, because somebody is going to get seriously hurt. Look at this post from a couple of days ago by Stephen Shaviro, an academic at Wayne State University in Detroit. So here is what I think about free speech on campus. Although I do not advocate violating federal and state criminal codes, I think it is far more admirable to kill a racist, homophobic or transphobic speaker than it is to shout them down. That's an actual professor working at an actual university. Now, there are many obvious objections to this. Firstly, that murder is never justifiable. Secondly, it's probably not a great idea to be openly advocating for murder on your Facebook page. I mean, it's not a great endorsement for the institution, is it? Come to Wayne State University, kids, where you can be taught by total sociopaths. But what Shaviro fails to take into account is that virtually everyone who is branded a racist, homophobe or transphobe these days is nothing of the kind. And in that context, when these terms are so misused so often, surely it's a little unwise to be claiming that murdering anyone so described is admirable. And the history books are full of this kind of thing. People demonising certain groups as subhuman in order to justify appalling violence and atrocities. If you call someone a TERF, they're no longer a human being. They're a cockroach, and cockroaches can be crushed. We are dealing with an ideological movement which is largely composed of fantasists who see Nazis in every shadow, who monster anyone who doesn't think it's fair for women to compete with biological males in sport, or anyone who doesn't think violent male rapists ought to be accommodated in women's prisons, or anyone who understands that sex is binary and that speaking the truth still matters. In other words, the people these activists consider to be mortal enemies, these Nazis of the imagination, comprise the overwhelming majority of the public. And that's a lot of Nazis. And this is the context in which Kellie-Jay Keen has been smeared, first by activists, then by the mainstream press. We are told that women's rights is a Trojan horse for fascism. And this misapprehension was made explicit in this cartoon in the New Zealand Herald. Here you can see Kellie-Jay Keen depicted as a large wooden horse surrounded by neo-Nazis. I have to say, I don't think this cartoonist understands what a Trojan horse is. I doubt very much the Greeks would have made it into the city of Troy if they'd been standing outside the horse. Kind of defeats the purpose. Surely the Trojan horse metaphor would work much better for individuals who, I don't know, claim to be compassionate and on the right side of history, but routinely send threats of death and rape to anyone who challenges their worldview. Gender identity ideology is often presented as sweet and cuddly with glitter and rainbow flags and be kind hashtags. But like the Trojan horse, there are plenty of angry men inside waiting to commit bloody carnage.